Hi, first of all, my name's Adam White. I'm on the Board of Governors here at the FCC, and I'd like to thank you all very much for coming out tonight for the launch of Hong Kong 2020, PEN's first anthology. PEN is a group of writers, academics, poets, and others who work with the written word. And the organization was founded in 2016 to stand against what they saw as an assault of freedom of expression on our city. Since Hong Kong returned to China 20 years ago, and especially in recent years, those who founded PEN Hong Kong have watched and worried as the space for creativity and freedom of expression in Hong Kong has shrunk. The organization's mission is to reverse this trend, to spread love for the written word, and to work with its peers in PEN chapters around the world to protect free expression anywhere it's under threat. Hong Kong 2020, Reflections on a Borrowed Place, is the result of this goal. PEN Hong Kong gathered voices together from both the English language and Chinese language communities, and the idea is to create one book that celebrates all of Hong Kong's creative spirit. And they also think of it as a declaration that the community of Hong Kong and writers in Hong Kong stands together in the face of threats to our freedoms. I have a quick list of thanks here. PEN would like to thank everybody who made the book possible, many of whom are in the audience tonight. Including many of the contributors, in addition to those who are speaking tonight. We have with us, I think this is accurate, we have Chip Tao, Oscar Ho, Louisa Lim, Michael O'Sullivan, Timothy O'Leary, and others, as well as the photographer Michael Kistler, who provided the photograph for the book's cover. Still going. Melvina Mack, who did the layout, and those who donated the crowdfunding site Fringebacker. And Fringe, which is working to support a Chinese language version of this book as well, and other PEN Hong Kong activities. PEN Hong Kong would also like to thank Pete Spurrier from Blacksmith Books, who is selling books so elegantly over there by the door. And all proceeds from the sales go back to PEN Hong Kong. There's also a donation box, so if you've enjoyed what you've seen here tonight, please donate to PEN Hong Kong. If you enjoyed the building you're in tonight, please join the FCC. Two sort of points of order. One is that you might have noticed that we, on the flyers, Joshua Wong was going to be here, and I'm afraid he's been called away on other business. Well, okay, I think he's currently being sort of manhandled off of the Golden Bohemia statue in Wan Chai. So it's a shame he can't be here with us tonight. The other thing is we have two empty chairs on the stage, but one of those is mine. And the other one here is for Liu Xiaobo. So it's a tradition across all PEN chapters across the world to have an empty chair to symbolize the fact that many dissident writers, poets, academics who can't attend events like this, who can't be here because their freedoms of expression or movement are curtailed. So that's the empty chair. It's not a mistake. Right, so I think with that, I'd like to introduce our first guest this evening, is Chris Chang, over here in the very natty suit. Chris is the editorial director of Hong Kong Free Press, and he'll be reading an essay about father and son searching for identity in a confused world.
Yeah, so let's see my parents. All right. Each spring, I face the same question about my travel plans. So, are you going to Saran this year? It's almost time you visit again. My father says, Saran or visit the mountains means to visit Zhongshan City in Guangdong Province. More specifically, and more importantly for my father, it means visiting the graves of my ancestors. I've never understood this ritual. I've never spent more than 3 days at a time in Zhongshan. Zhongshan is known for its hot springs and for being named after Sun Yat-sen, the founding father of modern China. But that's about all. The trips for me consist mostly of watching older family members perform rituals on the hill to pay respects to my grandparents at the ancestral home. They trim the wild grass, place fruit and other gifts on the graves, throw paper money as an offering. They only need me at the end to maybe pour some wine on the graves or just bow. Then we have a roast pig with relatives. These traditions never meant much to me, except that I knew they were a way to pay respect to my ancestors. All of these seems to be happening in such a remote place, far, far away in mainland China. But it is mostly because of my grandfather that was born and raised in Hong Kong. My grandfather, whom I have never met, was a member of the ousted Kuomintang. He's also a train station manager, according to my father. My grandfather did not like the Communist Party. One day, he badmouthed it and was later convicted as a counter-revolutionary and sent to a labor camp in the northeast province of Heilongjiang for 10 years. He survived, but lived in fears after returning home to Zhongshan, and he died a few years later. So my father left China to come to Hong Kong in the 1980s because there was not much opportunity for him on the mainland. He was a teacher, a primary school teacher, but because of his family background, he could never join the party. So therefore, he would not have been able to rise very far in his career as a teacher. My father ran a label printing company in Hong Kong to feed the family, but he never cared about politics. He said, "Those who suit the actions to the time are wise." He often said it to me, quoting a Chinese adage. He thought the young people in Hong Kong who joined the mass protests against anything from the Express Rail link and other wasteful publicly funded infrastructure projects or against the government in general are a weird bunch, including me. Why care about politics so much, he would ask. Why provoke the government and end up like your grandfather? But to me, I have a different answer. The answer comes naturally. If you're born and raised in Hong Kong, then you care about Hong Kong more than anything. My father and I grew up very differently. He's reserved in politics because of his father's history. He's concerned about the news, but does not want to participate actively in any events. He's probably representative of Hong Kong's older generation. He and my mother lived through the times of Cultural Revolution. He saw firsthand the risk of speaking out and keeps his opinion to himself. He said, "If there wasn't the Cultural Revolution, if I ever have the opportunity to study more, I would have been much smarter than you." He often said that over dinner, pointing at me. So you can voice your opinion in a civil manner, but you don't want to be on the front lines. But for me, the younger generation raised here in Hong Kong did not really encounter that fear of repercussion for speaking out until recently. The Hong Kong we grew up in were relatively free. We have freedom of speech. We can join public debates form our own opinions and our own identities. For example, not everyone supports an independent Hong Kong, but surely young people fear that if we cannot discuss this topic and other topics freely, things may go down a slippery slope. For me, I was born on November 30th, 1989 in Hong Kong. My mother often had a joke. She said it was a difficult birth, and she has to watch the TVB anniversary celebration from a hospital bed. So she had to spend a week or two leading up to my birthday. But for me, I do not have any significant memories of the political events before 1997. I was 8 years old. British Hong Kong days were very vague for me. I would never taught how to sing God Save the Queen. I did not know anything about the United Kingdom except a relative who lived there. I do have one memory from the night of June 30th, 1997, because my mom told me to switch on the TV and to watch the handover ceremony. I watched it because she told me to, but I don't understand what it was. After the handover, the only difference I noticed was the gradual change of the postal boxes from the rounded colonial red ones to new rectangular green ones. It's an easy change for the young people to spot. The SARS pandemic in 2003 that killed more than 250 people here and frightened the world did not really affect me. I was 14. We weren't too afraid, although my parents did wear masks to work. For me, as a student, it just meant a break from school. On July 1st that year, 500,000 people marched to protest the proposed national security legislation that would have defined sedition in vague terms and made it easier to arrest people for speeches critical of the government. But I was still too young to understand it. In the early days after the handover, years before Beijing tried to implement a controversial national education curriculum here, I remember very little education about who we are, only a subject called civics. Surely they taught us about the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, the so-called cradles of Chinese civilization. But we also learned the national anthem of the PRC, but are very removed about the topics. What I actually remember the most were lessons about not crossing the road on a red light or not picking up people's money on the street that doesn't belong to you. That's the national education. I may not have a ready answer if you ask me, are you a Chinese? But I can surely describe how a civilized person should behave according to what the teachers teach you. And yes, I was a good student and passed the first secondary school public exam in flying colors, so I was allowed to skip a year. Because I was basically free from studies, I think I was open to political enlightenment. The relative freedom came for me during 2006 and 2007, during the protests against the demolition of the former Star Ferry Pier. Those who favor demolition argue the structure was a symbol of colonialism. But like many other young people, I have no vivid memory of the colonial days, so it just represents Hong Kong itself and did not necessarily represent the past. At that time, activists such as Eddie Zhu, you know him as a lawmaker now, and others used the term collective memory. It was the first shock for me that this term has now disappeared from local media, but at the time it makes all the sense to me. I do belong somewhere, I do have an identity, and even though many issues in Hong Kong are quite distant from me, it is somehow my responsibility to care. The Oath Movement to save the old Starry Ferry Pier were compared to 1966 riots sparked by the fair race of the Star Ferry, which was supported by the colonial government, which triggered the hunger strike of a 27-year-old man called So Sao Chung. Crowds of people supported him, and his cause riots erupted after he was arrested and sentenced to jail. Only after the protest did my father tell me Mr. So, this Mr. So, was actually a relative of ours as well. So he mentioned after seeing an article in the newspaper, and he even asked me whether I could find a number for Mr. So. I did, but my father didn't call him. So apparently Mr. So left his family to become a monk. Perhaps So's ordeal was another reason why my father did not encourage people to protest. But although I never met So, and he was only a distant cousin, I felt a historical connection to him and feel less alone. Just to skip a bit, I joined the protest during the Beijing Olympics in Hong Kong. Some of our banners made fun of the overwhelming Chinese nationalism being pushed by the mainland and the Hong Kong government. Others of our friends in the protest called for more rational view of the Chinese identity that will allow people to choose their own identity and not have one forced upon them. One banner read, "China is an inalienable part of Mongolia." Poking fun at the statement made by mainland officials and pro-Beijing figures in Hong Kong that any part of the world that belonged to China historically must be a China now. Well, that plan failed. The protest was stopped, but for that time, I was a typical first-year university student, questioning everything that I had been told, and the incident made me resent how an identity was being forced upon us. Why should we not question our own identity? Even if everyone identifies as Chinese, what exactly is the relationship between Hong Kong and China, and who can we be? Back to my father, he doesn't doubt his Chinese roots. His bedtime readings are Chinese classical novels, such as The Outlaws of the Marsh and Romance of the Three Kingdoms. He reads them over and over again. He writes splendid calligraphy that I could never hope to replicate. I write commentaries in Chinese newspapers as well, but to him they were the arc of an amateur. He said, "Hong Kong schools don't teach enough about Chinese history and culture. You are a university graduate. Didn't your school teach you how to read and write classical literature? Your writing skills are so appalling," he said. Then I'm usually speechless about what he said. He never spent a day in the Hong Kong education system and probably would never understand his standard for literature are just simply too high for local students. But I understand where his expectation come from, and I just agree to disagree. And fast forward for a bit, after some years of protest, my political concern did not waver, but perhaps because of the subtle influence from my family. After university, I chose to be on the sidelines as a journalist. I write in English to explain to a wider audience what I see from a local perspective, to help those outside Hong Kong and the Chinese-speaking community understand these important chapters in our lives and our fears that the promises made to us in the Basic Law and in the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 are being broken by our leaders. Our freedom is in jeopardy. My father still wishes that I were in business and would stay out of politics, and probably a lot of other parents of children in my generation would feel the same. But at least he respects my choice to do what I do and is happy that I kept quote-unquote safe distance. In fact, my father is becoming more active in current affairs himself, even if quietly and indirectly. A few years ago, my father joined in an association of people from Zhongshan. He explained to me he wanted to help his hometown, particularly the people who helped him during the years of turmoil in China. He's now an active member, often joining trips back to Zhongshan to do volunteer work or attending gala dinners to raise funds to improve the city. To show him the support he has shown me, I often tell him I respect his choice as well. But I also tell him he should be careful of political involvement himself through the association, which often encourages members who live in Hong Kong to support pro-Beijing causes. At the request of his association, sometimes my father even turned up at some pro-government events, but he maintains he is simply being pragmatic. Sometimes I show him news reports of some pro-government protesters who are paid to show up, and I jokingly tell him it was a bit foolish of him to pay bus fares out of his own pocket to attend. But he said, he explains, I don't like the Communist Party as well, more than anyone, but I'm not opposing everything for the sake of opposing, he said. I support whatever is good for Hong Kong and my hometown. I may not fully relate to my father's emotional attachment to his hometown, but at the same time, he may not completely grasp the concerns I have about mine, as we grew up very differently. But I'm thankful that we can talk about our disagreements honestly, and at least I can understand how he came to hold his views, and maybe with time he will understand how I came to hold mine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mishi Saran, who's the author. Did I say that right? I said that right. Okay. Who's the author of The Other Side of Light, which was shortlisted for the 2013 Commonwealth Book Prize, and her travel book/memoir Chasing the Monk's Shadow was shortlisted for India's 2006 Hutch Crossword Book Award. She has written award-winning short stories, which have been broadcast on the BBC, and she returned to Hong Kong in 2014 after a decade away. She's currently writing a novel set in Shanghai, but the short story she's reading this evening is about getting a phone call from a Wan Chai hotel quite late at night, which is familiar to some of us.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. I just want to say quickly that it's, as one of the 4 editors of this anthology, it's been an amazing privilege and pleasure to collect these voices. And I think Chris's story, which we all loved, basically illustrates beautifully what we're trying to do, which is show that there isn't one Hong Kong. It's not a monolithic thing. There's, even within the same family, there's 2 or 3 or 4 interpretations of Hong Kong. And so what we at PEN are trying to do is really try and explain, as the culture critic Ray Chow asks, what would it mean for Hong Kong to write itself in its own language? And the answer to that possibly is, there's not one Hong Kong, there's possibly 8 million different Hong Kongs. The question is, we need to be able to talk about it and discuss it and debate it without hindrance. So, yes, it's true. It's a story about getting a phone call in the middle of the night. It's interesting. I wrote this short story for the anthology, which is an interesting experience because it's fiction, which means the characters are made up. I wrote it in the first person, and I learned that people are making discreet inquiries to find out who this Anton is. But I promise you, he's completely made up. So the narrator, who's not me, and Anton have been exploring a relationship. I'm going to read a section which straddles the handover. They've been traveling around trying to figure out where this thing is going. When we finally left Macau and returned to Hong Kong, I told Anton no. I didn't say that being with him was like living on the outer curl of a typhoon's tail, flying through empty sky, lashing around the Earth's poles. I didn't say it was too much, too soon, that I did not know the secret to embracing the wind. I understood dimly that I wanted a life like a Japanese room, tidy, spare, with one low table holding a creamy ceramic vase, a hint of a flush at its flank. I rested my hand along Anton's jawline, my fingertips on his Chinese cheekbones. I looked into the grey eyes gifted by his English father. Anton was crying, the way men cry. There's an element of surprise. He said that all the histories and geographies swirling inside him were driving him mad. He said he had chosen his paternal grandfather to follow. Since I can't have you, he said. I wiped my own sudden tears. Yet. You can't have me yet. I'm just saying I need time. Leaving doesn't solve. I keep feeling for home, like a tongue feels for an absence in a gum. So maybe home is here, in this moment, in this conversation. A few months later, Anton left Hong Kong and moved to Beijing. We never spoke again. Over the years, I got snippets of news about him from journalist friends passing through Hong Kong, friends who knew us both. He'd studied Mandarin and spoke it like a local. He'd married a Beijing woman, someone well connected in government circles. They said it made things easier. He was writing a book on China, not a mighty political tome on the rise of Deng Xiaoping, but about ordinary people living in Beijing hutongs. He had spent months interviewing people about their lives. I pictured Anton blending in easily with his Chinese bones, his dark hair. But if he looked up, those Atlantic grey eyes would startle. Occasionally, if a news item on TV panned across Beijing streets, I imagined I saw him bicycling through blue suit streets in the early days. Later, I pictured him on a motorcycle, dodging the cars. And still later, I put him in a car as the money grew and the lines between ideologies blurred. The truth was, I'd lost him. As for myself, I did not leave Hong Kong after the handover. There was no obvious place to go and no immediate reason to leave. I found a comfortable editing position at the research wing of a boutique investment firm. The pay was excellent, and I liked the CEO, Mr. Wong, a well-heeled Hong Kong man with a penchant for collecting fine jade. He had bought out his British partner, who had retired to Bedfordshire a few years after 1997. His final task had been to help Mr. Wong's son gain entrance to Eton. If Hong Kong was now a part of China, in the beginning it hardly seemed to ripple the rhythm of our days. Sure, the post boxes were different, though every now and again we still spotted one in an island market, a post box that carried the old raised letters ER, topped with a dotted crown, whispering empire amid the smell of dried fish. Our congenial firm's office started out at the Lucky Building in Wellington Street, then shifted progressively as the rents grew higher. Soon after I met S, we drifted into a gentle love. When we merged our paths and found a small flat together in Wan Chai, I saw that I had rebelled my way straight into a system. Still, that it all took place in Hong Kong gave my hours a spiced edge, as though I required this rigorous backdrop to counterbalance the terrible banality of the years unspooling of growing old. In Hong Kong, even commonplace days became a story with tension and sparkle. It turned out that my life had become a Chinese antique shop on Hollywood Road, crammed with unrelated, dusty items of porcelain and rosewood, the detritus of somebody else's decorated days. I found I quite liked it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next we have Ilaria Maria. Wait, no, we don't. We've got Larry, don't we? Sorry. Larry Feign. He's a writer and artist whose work was blacklisted for several years, straddling the handover after a high-profile episode of political censorship. I have incredibly fond memories of reading his cartoons in anthologies when I was far too young to really understand, how, well, for one, funny they were. So, please.
This is the visual entertainment part of the show. There's a quote that's been attributed to Winston Churchill and others that goes, "History is written by the victors." Sadly, no one named Victor was available to write a history of Hong Kong's handover to China. So, when the British newspaper, The Independent, decided to cover the story of Hong Kong's last 100 days under British colonial tyranny, they chose to do so through the eyes of a cartoonist. I'll confess an interest in the matter, being the cartoonist commissioned for the task, but even if it had been someone else, I'd have seconded the idea. Hong Kong had been a den of absurdities for the previous 10 years. Those 100 days before the transition promised any humorist an embarrassment of riches. I actually looked forward to the change in sovereignty. At long last, people would talk about something, anything, other than, so what are you doing after 1997? 20 years later, all anyone talks about is how much better things were before 1997. Well, maybe not everybody. Some simply don't speak such thoughts out loud. Others are paid 50 Mao to write the opposite in online comments sections. Who's right? The trouble is, there's never been a definitive version of Hong Kong history. The city was founded by scoundrels, populated by refugees. It wasn't until the late 1980s that more than half of Hong Kong's population had actually been born here. Hong Kong had always been a haven of convenience to escape chaos on the mainland or to get rich and move on. There was no deep sense of belonging, no Hong Kong identity. History didn't matter. Covering Hong Kong's transition was like writing on a blank slate. Every worst-case scenario rang true, but so did the best. On the day of the handover, Bauhinia flags flew, chests were beaten, speeches were given in Mandarin. Hong Kong was again a proud part of a strong and powerful China. 156 years of humiliating colonial history was at last avenged. The East was now, finally, fully red. Then the next thing they did was build a Disneyland. Is it any wonder that cartoonists make the best historians? And that's my piece from the book. Now, I wanted to show you some of these cartoons that I referred to, which are also in the book. These were done for the British newspaper, The Independent. It was their idea. Just so you know, The Independent offered these cartoons to every Hong Kong publication for free, and every one of them declined, in English and in Chinese. But there's 3 in this book. I hope this is loaded by now. This is the first one that appeared 99 days before the handover. Should I read it? Yes. Yeah, okay. So these are my characters, Lily Wong and her husband Stuart. It says Hong Kong 99 days and counting. And Lily asks, do you think China will take away freedom of the press after June 30th? Stuart says, of course not. And Lily says, because they promised not to under the basic law? He says, because they don't need to. And I mean, this was literally true. If you looked at the headlines in the papers at the time, English and Chinese, they were all gushing about the wonderful glory days ahead and good riddance to democracy. There were literally articles like that in the self-censored Morning Post. And the title of the book that I compiled these into was kind of paraphrased from an editorial which basically said, in other words, let's all shut up and make money. So anyway, this was the first one in the series, which I think still rings true today. And just to show that I'm fair, I wasn't just critical of Chinese treatment of Hong Kong. So Lily at the time worked in the government in the Office of Prevarication and Obfuscation, which was the government's main task throughout the years before the handover. And so they're clearing out the offices. She says, look at us, cleaning up after the British. But has Britain ever lifted a finger for Hong Kong? And her colleague, Mr. Chang, says, of course they have. And that was my feeling, and I think Margaret Thatcher should rot in hell, where she probably is right now, for what she did to this place. And then this was from the June 30th cartoon. Of course, I drew this a few days beforehand. And Lily and Stuart are out with their young daughter, Crystal. And he says, look at the handover fireworks, Crystal. Lily says, they remind me of our liberties and freedom here in Hong Kong. Stuart says, yeah, lighting the way to a better future. She says, no, going up in smoke. And I think a lot of people shared the fear that rainy evening. And that's my contribution to the book. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Next up we have Ilaria Maria Salah. She's an award-winning journalist and writer. She's lived in East Asia since 1998. She is in fact a former president of this club, I believe. Is that not right? Yeah, there you go. She had to remember. You spend long enough in this place and it all blurs into a... Anyway, her piece is a fictionalized account of redevelopment on Lantau Island and the destruction of memory and beauty.
Thank you. Actually, before I start reading, since this is Pen Hong Kong event, I spotted in the audience some people who have asked how to join Pen Hong Kong. And you certainly can, as long as you have something to do with the written word and favor it in a free form rather than censored one. And we are on the brink of being able of getting members in. So by all accounts, before this event is over, if you're interested in joining PEN, either let me know or leave your name card with the book stand, and we'll follow up very, very soon, because finally things are ready for this. So after this announcement, I'll read my piece, which is titled Lantau Island. Bear in mind that he was the descendant of Zulu princes. That's what he said. And it is not the kind of thing you'd forget. I do not promise to be accurate, but the first time we met was the first time I had come to the island, which is a funny way of saying it, really, since Hong Kong Island is obviously an island too. But you get on the ferry to Lantau and you get a text from someone who wants to know what you're up to, and you say, I'm going to the island, meaning Lantau Island. At 147 square kilometers, it is the largest of the islands that make up the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. It is the largest, but it had been partially forgotten until 1991, when the colonial authorities started building the new airport, beginning with a 9.38 square kilometer land reclamation project that connected the small island of Cheblak Kok and Lam Chau to the northern shore of Lantau. The airport opened in 1998, thus starting its life under Beijing's sovereignty. In the fitful months before the handover, even the airport had been a source of controversy and quarreling between the outgoing British authorities and the incoming Chinese ones. The airport is too expensive, they cried from Beijing. Maybe they feared that a lavish airport would mean a Hong Kong handed back to them with depleted coffers. Or maybe they were afraid the grandness of the international airport here would dwarf that of the others in the Pearl River Delta. Nobody really could tell in the cacophony of constant bickering that lasted until midnight, June the 30th. Whatever unhappiness Beijing felt about the airport, though, the project's completion marked the beginning of a development frenzy in one of Hong Kong's green lungs that is not over yet and that is on the cusp of becoming a disaster. I'm going to get to this shortly, but as I try to tell you his story, the descendant of princes, I mean, there are so many threads that call for attention that it is hard to stick to just one narrative. Anyway, back then, it must be close to 15 years ago, I got off the ferry in Mui Wo and was walking along the winding paths trying to figure out if there were landmarks I could pin my eyes to. They all say it for a reason. In Hong Kong, you are never more than half an hour away from greenery. Leung Chun-ying, the divisive chief executive we have had since 2012, scheduled to step down in June 2017, has done all he could to make this less of a reality, and the damage he has unleashed on the territory is heartbreaking, or infuriating, depending what mood you're in at the moment. In spite of his pro-Communist Party left-wing credentials, the former surveyor has embraced the real estate developers with reckless abandon. Should I have written in spite of? Is because of more apt? When people complain that Hong Kong might turn into just another Chinese city, surely this is part of what they mean, the vicious destruction of memories that weave themselves in and out of the landscape, the pulverization of complex local communities whose grounds are turned into cookie-cutter condos for real estate speculators, too often coming from the mainland. Yes, no point in being cute about it, even as they live God knows where, leaving the flats empty. I'm getting ahead of myself again. We were still at the very beginning of all this when I first saw him, and I couldn't figure him out. The descendant of Zulu princes, he said. Some intense British imperial wandering meant he also was more than one part Indian, I believe, and so much else. So there I was in Mui Wo for the first time, and I was wondering which direction I had taken and where it was going to lead, as I looked at the densely green hills, the bend in the river that goes to the beach, and the neatly farmed fields with old CDs and weather-beaten stuffed toys hanging from poles stuck in the dirt, like postmodern scarecrows. And I hesitated, while he was standing there, a cup of coffee in his hands, perfectly aware of my presence, a stranger to discretion. "This is what we do all day," he bellowed in greeting. "We stare at the leaves, all day long. So green," he said, half moaning and half laughing. Was he being sarcastic? Was I meant to answer? Who was he, anyway? You don't need to answer every greeting in Hong Kong. It is okay to be warm and it is okay to be rough. What has not changed in 20 years? It's a fast city. Business is business. Whatever goes wrong, you can say you had no time, you were too busy. So I didn't reply. I sent some kind of a smile in his direction, looked at my companion who was similarly perplexed, and we walked onwards, or maybe backwards. That leafy path, so familiar today, looked like a riddle then. Shortly after, I left behind the constant construction noise of my former neighborhood in Shenzhen and moved here, to the island. As it always happens, as one becomes slowly accustomed to a new place, unexpected landmarks popped up everywhere from the indiscernible mass. The eye suddenly recognizes a flaming tree just before the bend in the small path, a Java apple jam-like mess on the ground that signals the arrival of summer, just before a small bifurcation, or farmer fences made on the cheap with old doors, pipes, construction leftovers, random plastic, and wooden planks that appear once you have cycled nearly all the way home. The prince's house, though, was a lot more than just a feature on the way home. It was hardly a proper house, with its leaky tin roof and shaky walls. Everybody knew about it, even if only a few had ever stepped inside. He was always standing or sitting outside, by the main path. He had adorned a large tree and a few shrubs with painted knickknacks, and managed to turn discarded junk into a decorating statement, at times tongue-in-cheek, but by and large unexpectedly tasteful. The decorations changed with the seasons. Silver and white ribbons and dried plants emerged for Christmas, painted eggs popped up at Easter, and all red hell broke loose for Lunar New Year. As time went by, though, I noticed it was usually not coffee in the mug, but beer, and that most of his visitors were of the heavy drinking sort. I'm not telling you the whole story. Some details are missing, some you really do not need to know, and others were always pure invention. But his presence, and now his absence, carved what seemed to be an indelible impression. His name was Mark. He would say hello or "Chao-san," or any greeting to that effect, to everybody who passed by, in a handful of languages. He spoke with a British accent, and eventually I saw photos of him looking dapper in London. At one point, he had followed a boyfriend here. Things had headed south abruptly, and he was still scarred from that. But I was not his confidant. He wore large designer glasses and kept his hair short. If people cycled past him in a hurry, late for the ferry, he would just call to them, "Ding ding!" Me, he called Maria Callas, because my first name can be a mouthful and because I like large sunglasses. One Christmas day, he seemed upset as I walked past. I wore a shalwar kameez that seemed perfect for the weather, but he disapproved, scoffing loudly behind me. "That is a Muslim dress." Once I walked past him while I was upset, and he took my hand and asked what was wrong, and I was not going to talk about it, but I frowned so painfully that he said, "Whatever happens, always keep your dignity. And walk away, like this." He let go of my hand and sashayed for a few steps in one direction and then the other, and afterwards someone told me Mark had been a model and a dancer, and now I know that, as I was looking at him then, he had not forgotten any of his former aspirations. And every day he was being fabulous, looking at the leaves and the birds and exchanging a short sentence, a whole conversation, or just a sound with anyone who walked by, in spite of the drinking. This is how he knew that the plan for Lantau, where he had lived longer than anybody I knew who was not born here, was simply awful, and that there was no way of stopping it, do what anyone may. I cannot explain, even at this point of the story, why the destruction of the island and his death seem connected, but somehow they are. Maybe because of the care he took in keeping his surroundings so chic, as if he wasn't doomed, as if the island could count on somebody to defend it.
Next up we have, thank you by the way, next up we have Marco, Yan and Nicholas Wong, two poets. Marco is a poet who earned his MFA degrees from New York University and HKU, and Nicholas is the author of Crevasse, which was the winner of the 28th Lambda Literary Award in Gay Poetry. And they'll be reading stuff from their own work and others, I believe. So, yes.
Thank you. And thank you for the, thanks to the editors who put together such a beautiful anthology at the 20th anniversary of the handover. So today I'll be reading 3 poems, and I'll begin with two that is related to mother and motherland, and then I'll close with one that that features a father figure. So the first poem, Rain as a mother's persistence, unsteady, tested over the hours when she sits beside her son at a dinner table, shoulders taut, her hand tight around his, guiding a pencil through lines of graphite, wild curves, limp thistles, and eraser lets loose to the 13 strokes, their family name in Chinese. The foolscap blackens the way their joint fist blacken until when the boy closes his eyes, he sees the word black upon black. Then his given name. The first character is think. The second means the expanse of many seas, more strokes and effort. Rain of April 1990 began on a morning like this, lucid, so light, and went on for days. Thank you. The second poem is actually about the umbrella revolutions that happened in 2014. And during that period of time, I remember I was being very frustrated because I wasn't able to participate because I was living in New York, and I actually wanted to write about not being able to be there. And but then personally, I avoid writing about political avoid writing about political issues, but. And then I talked to one of my teachers, Edward Hirsch, and then he said, "It's not. You don't have to write about you don't have to think about it as a political issue. Just think about the people. Think about, what is politics without people, and just go deep into the people, go deep into their response to the environment that they're in." So, so I wrote this. So. Days of November 2014. The girl grabbed an umbrella, a color she learned to prize, and left for school, knowing this subtropical island had become so red, so warm, there'd be downpours in early winter. Should the sky stay clear, she'd block the sun. If not the sun, then pepper spray. Tear gas, rubber bullets, whatever the police in the dark would use. She returned at dusk to the makeshift study erected on one lane of Harcourt Road to revise her history test, and tried to conclude what was missing, what had gone wrong, not minding the onlookers, their voices, or being reduced by the cold lens of a camera. She was present, part of the past that would glint as a yellow pixel on the next day's front page. So, thank you. So the 2 poems about motherland, and then I'll end with a poem about fathers and how to make peace with being sons and daughters and descendants. We cannot see the trees our father planted because we are ungrateful, because of lightning and sparks, though it seems the thunder is doing the heavy work. They split, fall, and sometimes the rain causes a runoff, water reaching the crowns, green mounds, halved globes, exposed like shells of tortoises who went discreetly extinct. Maybe you are the tree, a friend says. but in front of a mirror, when my brother and I stand side by side, we are nothing. We have our eyes checked. We wear glasses and see the seeds sown, the land left fallow, and then ourselves. What can we say? We are breathing, unfazed, our skin warm in the sun. We almost photosynthesize. Thank you.
People hate and love poets. They hate poets because they're ambiguous. They love poets because they're very quick. We, Pan Hong Kong, believe in bridging the gap between Chinese writing and English writing in Hong Kong. That's why we have a fringe backer campaign going on, and I think we are 19% backed already, and we need your 10%. So the first keyword for you tonight is fringe backer. Second keyword is fish balls, because I'm going to read you a poem involving fish balls. I'm not going to read my work, although my poems are in this book. And I have to thank my colleagues who did tremendous amount of work to make this book happen. Jason, Sarah, Mishi, and also Tammy at the back. I have to out you, sorry, too shy. I'm going to read a poem by a local Chinese poet called Zhao Feign. Because when we think about Hong Kong poets, we always name Liang Bingguan and then Louisa Lim, and who else? And there are actually plenty. We have some very nice translations here, written by very good local poets and translated by world-class translators. So I'm going to read a poem called Up and Down the Slope by Zhao Feign, who's actually writing about the public housing estates in Hong Kong. I'm going to read the Chinese version first, followed by the English translation. And there's one very strange word in the English translation called perlicule, which refers to the area between your thumb and your forefinger. Okay, and that's how you make fish balls. You squeeze the thing out, okay? 上坡下坡，至屯門青陽街熟食市中心。周漢輝。青陽街上坡也下坡，承擔小貨車接送你。上學前、放學後，抵達工場，更像回家。從各自的家起步，在工作上遇合，在工作以外結合。你牽着我，霧雨登高，沒有多高。工場也不過安頓於熟食市場角落。你定睛魚蛋鬱鬱升起。父的虎口製造每次日出，一把扇子像倒載的船，運我兩翼水。工廈浮備，因工人們流失多時無重，唯孤島靠爐火殘留洪流中。火星像風，餐具整天交響，像成長。伙計食下間的話題，像父握你的手。教你的虎口，也握日後你兒孫的虎口。我們的手分開了，預結，宿感情有多深？你低頭對工場顧子，後對洞嶺落泡沫熙攘，正招呼食時盛景。我自然不在場，熟食市場同一個食檔，人群依時回流，下午茶。例牌奶油多，央酒，包圍父與你，偷閒才像工作。當我在場，食檔送客關門，街道處處雨蛙，雜綠雲變。和園街里告訴我的家事，青陽街上坡也下坡。Up and down the slope for Tuen Mun Ching Yang Circuit Cooked Food Market by Zhao Hanfei. Up and down the Ching Yang Circuit, a little truck picks you up before and after school. Back to the workshop is more like a homecoming. Out of our separate homes, we come together for work and meet again outside of work. You hold my hand in the rain. We climb a low hill. The workshop takes up only one corner of the food market. You stare at the fish balls bobbing. every sunrise squeezed out of death's purlieu. An umbrella, like an upturned boat, carries us upstream, dodging industrial buildings, losing workers on a daily basis. No other weight but a lone island with a stove fire left on the stream. Wind sounds like fire. Forks and spoons, like growing up, clatter all day. What waiters and diners chat about is like this: Dad holding your hand, showing you the purlieu of your hand, which is also the purlieu of a son's and grandson's hands. Our hand pull apart. Sheltering from rain, we realize how deep silence can be. You lower your head towards what used to be the workshop, then to the cold lemon coke's fizzing, recalling the hubbub of the places past. Naturally, I wasn't here. The same stall at this food market, people came on time for afternoon snacks. You and Dad's daily coffee tea mix and toast, both with condensed milk. Slacking off is more like working. When I was there, the store was closed and the customers were turned away. Puddles all along the street reflect the changing clowns and the family affairs that you told me about, and up and down the changing circuit. Thank you.
Thank you to you both. Okay, so our last speaker tonight is Louisa Lim. She's an award-winning journalist who reported from China for a decade for NPR and the BBC. She just flown in today, actually, only a few hours ago, just to be here for this. So thank you very much for that. Her story is a wonderful look at growing up in Hong Kong with a Chinese father and a posh British mum, and is in many ways way too close to home for me. So.
Thank you so much, and I'm really delighted to be in this anthology, and thank you to all the editors for your hard work. Our small world was suspended between the two cultures. My parents had transgressed racial norms and continued to quietly do so. Though ethnically Chinese, my father had managed to snag a position as a colonial civil servant, so he became that most oxymoronic of categories, the Chinese expat. My posh British mother, despite her execrable tone-deaf Cantonese, became one of the first experts on Hong Kong's local cultural heritage. She spent her spare time trudging around abandoned study halls and dusty earth god shrines, a pastime we found unutterably dull. Our parents' social world revolved around an unfortunately named club for couples consisting of Chinese men and Western women. The Mix-Up Club was born out of the social opprobrium that such pairings attracted, shunned by both Western and Chinese communities, though it was later renamed the M Club to avoid being mistaken for a cross-cultural swingers outfit. We often celebrated holidays with the other mix-ups, the kids running wild as the Western wives swapped Chinese recipes and the Chinese fathers compared their children's exam results. We walked the mile to and from school in packs. When we were feeling particularly brave, we would dare each other to run alone through the corridors of a house on Conduit Road, haunted by a British sea captain who'd leapt off the balcony to his death. Holding my breath with all my senses vibrating, I would speed through the corridors in a flustered panic. The rhythmic slap, slap, slap of my white plimsolls against the floor echoed behind me, sounding ever more like the footsteps of a phantom pursuer at my heels. Ghosts of another kind dogged the families at my school. Hong Kong has always been a city of refugees, outcasts and chancers fleeing communism, poverty, or disgrace in one form or another. Over the 4 decades since we first met, my classmates' family histories have unspooled over pints of cold beer into stories operatic in their scope and tragedy. Tales of huge mansions lost by opium addicts, of ancestors forced to hide in the jungle, of family fortunes destroyed in fires that burnt down entire villages, of children bought and children sold. Stories of unimaginable public disgrace in a society where faces are valued above all else. As insiders, we were privy to epic secrets. As outsiders, we shared them openly. Those ghosts and the fear of them were a driving force. Our parents, shaped by their families' turbulent histories, wanted to pave our paths with solid exam results leading to respectable jobs. They hoped our diligence would smooth the stigma of their unorthodox matches. We were Mongols, neither true Gwailos nor purely Chinese. We mix-ups didn't even have a proper name. Anglo-Chinese was too Victorian. Eurasian bore a ring of the Raj. Half-caste was simply offensive. Like ghosts, we flitted between two worlds, becoming interpreters and intermediaries between the two sides of ourselves. We were people from the future who transcended the stale, fixed identities of the past and whose worldview was formed by the constant shape-shifting and code-switching. We never questioned our right to think of ourselves as Hong Kongers. To us, Hong Kong's unusual status, suspended between British and Chinese rule, made it the embodiment of our identity, while we were the natural corollaries of its peculiar political proposition. But back then, I had no idea that any acceptance of our mixed race in Hong Kong was at best grudging, at worst purely aspirational. Our most important streets were named after colonial governors, but I had no idea the men we memorialized had pushed through anti-Chinese legislation that prefigured South African apartheid. The 8th governor, James Pope Hennessy, along whose eponymous road the bottle green trams trundled, actually listed the ways British distrusted the vast majority of Chinese residents as dishonest, potentially dangerous, malevolent, engaged in mysterious secret societies, foolish in their religious beliefs, and only suitable to be clerks, shroffs, armors, houseboys, and coolies. In 1842, the Chief Magistrate, William Cain, along whose road I used to walk, introduced a nighttime curfew for Chinese alone that lasted for the most part of 4 decades. The 2nd governor, Sir John Davis, on whose mount we used to hike, required Chinese to carry registration tickets or face flogging, a punishment not meted out to British residents. Then, in 1904, a ban was placed on Chinese and Eurasians living on the Peak by the colonial administrator, Sir Francis Henry May, who later became the 15th governor. This last discovery was a stunning personal blow to me, since I was distantly related to May and used to boast about this in the playground in happy ignorance of my ancestors' racist authoritarianism. In fact, he was most famous for being the subject of a failed assassination attempt on the first day of his governorship. But we had grown up in a place whose history was intentionally left blank. We did not learn of the Opium War or treaty ports, though glancing references were made to foot binding and rickshaws as exemplars of Chinese cruelty. Through our headmistress, Miss Handyside, and her ilk, we had internalized the colonial mindset without even realizing it. So conditioned had I become that it did not even hit me until the very first day that Hong Kong returned to Chinese sovereignty. By then, I was working in the newsroom of a thoroughly amateur local television station, stammering my way through stilted, utterly news-free reports on bridge openings and lantern festivals. As the handover approached, we knew we were ill-equipped to report on our transfer of sovereignty, though we had gamely planned hour after hour of live feeds. I was supposed to be covering the story from Beijing, but I'd resisted, making excuses because I couldn't countenance the thought of not being in Hong Kong. So I stayed in the office, getting strobe glimpses of the anachronistic pomp as I sped round the newsroom, frantically editing pieces and banging out host intros. I ran past screens showing the last governor, Chris Patten, dripping as he made his defiant farewell address in the pouring rain. I was in the edit suites when the Democratic Party leader, Martin Lee Chu-ming, appeared on the balcony of the then Legislative Council building, pledging that democracy would return to Hong Kong. I don't even remember where I was at the moment when the British flag slid down the flagpole. But I do know that I did not have time to process how this moment of transition could upend the fulcrum on which our lives balanced. It was the next morning that I realized, in a moment of sickening clarity, just how great our lack of foresight had been. The Pattons had already tearfully motored out on Her Majesty's yacht Britannia, and the foreign press were packing up. When I stumbled into work on July the 1st, the newsroom was almost empty. The news agenda was sparser still. Our focus on the British departure had been so all-encompassing that we'd simply forgotten to think about Hong Kong under Chinese rule. We had not mapped out any plans or themes going forward. We'd reached the end of history, and even though our story had ended, we found we had nothing else to say. Thank you.